Can I introduce our first speaker, who is Antony Ramm. Antony is a librarian manager for the local and family history library at the Leeds Public Libraries, and his talk is going to be on Leeds and its history in the Central Library collections. Over to you, Antony.
Thank you, Alan. I'll share my screen now. Hopefully this will work, as people always say. Can everybody see? Is that up on the screen now?
Yes, excellent.
Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to my talk, as Alan said, entitled Leeds and its History in the Central Library Collections. I'm Antony, the librarian manager for the Local and Family History Department, based at the Central Library. On the second floor, that's the room you can see behind me in my virtual background, if I am still on the screen where you are. So the aim of this talk really is to offer a kind of a brief history of Leeds, covering the 15th to the 21st centuries. That historical chronology is primarily a framework that allows me to highlight some of the most interesting and unique items that we hold at the Central Library. Items that hopefully illustrate or represent particular periods in Leeds' past. As such, I'm definitely making no claims to completeness in this history, nor necessarily formulating any kind of new argument about the city and its past. Certainly other histories could be constructed from the materials that we hold at the Central Library. And my particular version clearly omits or jumps over some very important people, places and periods. I am in any case constrained by the limits of what we do and do not hold in those collections in the first place. Having said that, certain themes do emerge and kind of reverberate across the centuries. Innovation, particularly the kinds of innovation that come from the competition and collaboration when talented people are concentrated in the same place at the same time. Leeds' place in national and international networks of trade and ideas, and the city's powers of dynamism and self-renewal, often driven by new arrivals into the region. A further note on content. Much of the talk is based on articles that I've written for the Central Library's heritage blog, Secret Library Leeds, over the last 5 years or so. So in a sense, this talk is a summary of the particular stock and collections that have most interested me over that period. I should also point out, however, that some of the content in the talk has been limited by which materials I've been able to access from home over the last 12 months. Obviously, when I first agreed to do this talk around a year ago, I was expecting to be able to have quite hands-on access to the materials. That has proved to not be the case, but I've done the best I can with what has been available to me. Speaking of content, I must give immense credit to my colleague Philip Wilde, who brought many of the following items to my attention during his own stock work in our collections and on whose research I have drawn, particularly in the early sections of the talk. Any interpretations, conclusions or mistakes are mine alone, however, and certainly do not reflect the views of Leeds City Council. Speaking of mistakes, I am very receptive to any corrections or additional information any listeners can provide today. Just finally, any photographs you will see that are not obviously identifiable as being of the items under discussion are from the Leeds Library's Leodis website, www.leodis.net. So to begin properly. We start our story some 500 years ago in the 15th century at Kirksall Abbey. Established by pioneering Cistercian monks in 1152, after a previous location in Craven proved unsuitable. Cistercian wealth, as many of us know, was largely derived from the wool trade, and Kirksall Abbey was certainly no different. Though the Abbey's involvement in Leeds itself was minimal during much of its existence, a limit on exports to Europe redirected some of the Abbey's wool trade to the town, thus stimulating the local wool textile industry, a topic we will continue with soon. For now, though, I want to draw your attention to the item on the right of this slide, which is the oldest item in the Central Library collections. That's an original charter from the Abbey, dated 1460. This charter is pasted in the back of a volume of transcriptions made by 18th century Leeds-based antiquarian Thomas Wilson, which you can see on the left, and which contains copies of around 200 charters and deeds relating to Kirksall Abbey. Wilson is the first of our innovators in this story, in that he rescued many of these charters from an old chest he found in Chapel Allerton, the charters and deeds being in various stages of ruin at the time of Wilson rescuing them. But what of Leeds itself in the 15th century? Well, around the same time our charter was being written in 1460, Leeds was described by one contemporary as being near Rothwell, a complete reversal of how we would describe those two places today. Leeds clearly had some developing to do, a claim further evidenced by looking at the Central Library's priceless copy of Christopher Saxon's famous Atlas of 1579, over a century after the Kirkcaldy Charter we have just seen. The slide on the screen here shows the page in Saxon's Atlas for Yorkshire, while the top extract on this slide shows Leeds itself in the centre of the image as a small to mid-sized town, not yet large enough to swallow up some of the separate villages and townships that we now consider part of the city itself. A comparison with the way Saxon has drawn York in the extract at the bottom is particularly useful for contextualising Leeds' relative size and importance in this period. Around the time of Saxon's Atlas, however, Leeds was beginning to emerge as a relatively significant town in the region, flourishing as a market centre on the back of a century of great expansion in the textile industry of the West Riding, which saw Leeds' population double between 1576 and 1626. The journey towards a more recognisable Leeds had begun. That aforementioned expansion of the textile industry greatly enriched the gentlemen merchants who would dominate the town's affairs from the 17th century until the early 19th century. That wealth allowed some members of that merchant elite to devote their time to the sorts of gentlemanly pursuits that situated them socially and culturally closer to the neighbouring gentry than the clothiers with whom they lived cheek by jowl in the crowded little town of the Restoration, as R.G. Wilson wrote in his classic 1971 book on the gentleman merchants. This included families such as the Thoresbys, of whom Ralph in particular turned much of the family wealth away from business and towards literary pursuits, dedicating his life to antiquarian collecting and writing. In this, Thoresby wasn't alone. Indeed, he was part of a wide national network of antiquarians, as his letters and diary attest. Some members of that network were very well known indeed, such as Sir Hans Sloane, who gifted Thoresby a slim book on ancient coins now in the Central Library collections. You can see the title page of that book on the left of the screen here. The notes made by both Thoresby and Sloane, which you can see on the right, speak to the intimate nature of their relationship, providing an interesting way of approaching and contextualising Leeds' wider place at this time. It offers evidence of Leeds, this relatively small provincial town, known primarily for its importance as a market centre, as still being connected through pioneers such as Thoresby to wider national and international networks of learning, an alternative republic of letters, as it has been called. One member of Thoresby's network, however, was more local, John Lucas, the master of Leeds Charity School until his death in 1750, and another diligent antiquary. In that latter field, Lucas's primary interest was his home parish of Wharton in Lancashire, but his instincts for recording and preservation are amply demonstrated in his famous Memoranda book, a record of daily life in Leeds between 1712 and 1750, the manuscript of which we hold at the Central Library. Though often mainly a record of national events, the Memoranda book also captures important occurrences in Leeds itself. Celebrations for the Peace of Utrecht, horse racing at Temple Newsome, and in December 1715, the first record of football being played in the town. Alongside those particularly eye-catching events are numerous accounts of everyday life, accidents, deaths, asides about the weather, business and political disputes, lavish meals and celebrations, unusual occurrences of all kinds, really. Visceral accounts of daily life, in short. Similar are the annotations made by Lucas's successor at the charity school, Thomas Wilson, in our copy of Thoresby's Ducatus Leodiensis. That's the same Thomas Wilson who collected the Kirkcaldy charters mentioned at the start of this talk. Of particular note are Wilson's updates to Thoresby's original text, which captured changes from the early 18th century, when the book was published, down to the 1740s and 50s when Wilson himself was writing, as in the extract on the top right of the screen, which shows Wilson's additions regarding the usage of the chapel in the grounds of St. John's Church. Wilson's annotations, combined with Thoresby's original text and Lucas's memorandum book, provide us with nearly 50 years of detail of daily life in 18th century Leeds, adding flesh and blood, as well as crucially, a sense of change and dynamism to the rather static, quiet impression we might otherwise get from the more familiar maps, plans, and prospects of this period, such as the ones we can see on the next slide. That dynamism was never more evident than when, at around the same time Wilson was writing, in 1758, Charles Brandling, the owner of the Middleton Colliery estate, successfully applied for an Act of Parliament to build a wagonway taking coal into Leeds. In doing so, Brandling effectively kick-started the next phase of Leeds development. This supply of relatively cheap coal would play a major role in stimulating the new or rapidly expanding industries of the era, most notably the manufacturing of woolens in mills like those of Benjamin Gott from the 1790s, a move to a factory system which brought many of the previously independent stages of textile production under one roof, changes that would uproot forever the seemingly settled world of the gentleman merchants, the genteel and leisurely world of Thoresby. Leeds rapidly expanded, with its population growing from 25,000 in 1790 to 88,000 in 1841. Factories brought demand for coal, but also for machinery. Both brought a need for talented and innovative engineers, men such as John Smeaton. The plans which you can see here, dated 1777, are almost certainly from the Smeaton workshop and possibly drawn by the man himself, and are most likely for the steam engine-driven pumping house, which was in operation at Middleton Colliery from 1780. The attribution to Smeaton is proved by his signature, or at least a copy of his signature, which you can see in the smaller image on the right. Engineering continued to grow in importance in Leeds' economic development, becoming the town's dominant employer by the end of the 19th century. Pioneers such as Matthew Murray, many of them not native Leeds men, were attracted to the town by its dynamism, the opportunities for those with entrepreneurial zeal. These plans also feature on their reverse the signature of Charles Brandling himself, dated 1780, which you can see in the top right image. Brandling's agent on the colliery estate at the time of the wagonway was a man intimately connected to the next item from the Central Library collections relating to this period, Richard Humble. Humble co-founded a pottery company in the 1770s after leaving Brandling's employ. The Leeds Pottery, a plan of which you can see here on the left. That plan shows how the colliery wagonway ran along the northern edge of the pottery works, providing the pottery with a ready supply of coal. That access allowed the pottery to develop quickly and with great success, most particularly in the production of its famous creamware, often called Leedsware. The pottery is represented in the Central Library through 9 drawing, pattern, and published design books. Images from both can be seen here. The drawing and pattern books on the left being visual guides for company potters and decorators, and the published design books on the right, probably being used by agents for advertising and sale purposes, with several designs being translated into French, German, and Spanish, a sign of Leeds' place in international networks of trade, taste, and influence. The Industrial Revolution had taken the Leeds name around the world, creating a long-standing reputation for excellence. As one scholar has noted, however, these changes to economic models bring other kinds of change. Industrialization creates massive economic and social change, as Patrick Kuhn has said. A truism, perhaps, but still very much the case in 19th century Leeds, when working class radicalism, a response from below to that industrialization, made a significant appearance, with one authority declaring Leeds second only to Manchester as a hotbed of northern radical politics in the first half of the 19th century. Leeds was home to several newspapers catering to this radicalism, including the Leeds Patriot in the 1820s and the Chartist Northern Star in the 1830s and 40s, original copies of which can be seen in the bottom section of this display cabinet at the Central Library. While the rather grainy image on the right shows a truncheon that we also hold, and which is said to have been used by a policeman in the August 1842 Chartist disturbances around Leeds and its townships. Many radicals and Chartists later sought public office, including men such as Robert Meek Carter and Dr. Frederick Richard Leeds, both of whom held positions as town councillors and later, in the 1860s and 1870s, were elected as MPs for Leeds. Both Carter and Leeds can be seen in this 1874 image from our collection of over 200 political cartoons, which caricature and satirise parliamentary elections in Leeds between 1868 and 1880. Leeds and Carter were both standing as Liberal candidates, alongside Edward Baines Jr., the emblem of Liberal power in 19th century Leeds. Also to be seen in the political cartoon collections are rather problematic caricatures of those Irish people who had migrated to Leeds in large numbers through the 1840s and 1850s, where they faced often intolerable housing conditions and low-paid employment in the textile mills of the town. The same broad pattern repeated itself through the 1880s and 1890s, when thousands of Jewish people from Eastern Europe arrived and settled in Leeds, most taking very low-paid employment in the newly flourishing sector of the ready-made clothing industry. I'll just pause for a second. Tailoring and the ready-made clothing industry, in fact, became increasingly important to Leeds through the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. Several famous names dominated the sector: John Barron, Montague Burton, Joseph Hepworth, and others, including Harris Summery, a Polish-Jewish immigrant who started in the trade in the 1890s, initially with a small tailoring workshop. Summery was increasingly successful through the early part of the 20th century, especially during the interwar years, when the company employed over 1,000 people and opened a huge factory in 1934 on York Road known as Summery House. You can see that in the photo in the bottom right here, a trajectory that can stand for the journey of the whole clothing and tailoring sector in Leeds. Leeds Central Library has a number of items relating to the Summery company, including clothing catalogues, pattern books, correspondence and ephemera, several of which contain original pieces of sample textiles, including the ones you can see here on the left, dating from the 1940s, which offer a wonderfully tactile way of experiencing history and material culture of everyday life. As well as simply being pleasurable to look at and, of course, to touch, I think these textile samples speak to a kind of self-confidence in the city's wares, a self-confidence ultimately in the city itself, its products, its people, and its future. This self-confidence, or civic pride perhaps, peaked, I think, around the turn of the 20th century in an era that has been called the Age of Flamboyance, to quote the title of an upcoming Civic Trust lecture from Kevin Grady. This was a period that saw Leeds gain city status in 1893, the opening of City Square in 1903, and the construction of many buildings whose solidity and grandeur exemplified the certitude that Leeds was here to stay. Such success in the present brought with it a stock-taking mood to the city's past, a desire to look back and reflect on just how far Leeds had come in the last few centuries. This spirit is perhaps not better captured than in the 1908 Old Leeds exhibition, the handbook and committee minute books for which are held at the Central Library. This exhibition, a joint venture between public libraries, the Thoresby Society and the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society, was a large display across several rooms of the art gallery, showcasing objects, books, prints and artwork representing various aspects of Leeds' long history. The exhibition was opened by Colonel T.W. Harding, whose romanticised vision of the city's past could only emerge from a perspective of relative comfort, stability, security, and wealth. Harding said at the opening ceremony, and I'll read out the whole thing, it seemed to him that there was value and certainly interest in looking backwards to recall the beginnings of a great city. If by that exhibition they could recall the Leeds of only, say, 250 or 300 years ago, with some amount of reality, it would be very interesting. Would it not, he asked, be interesting to picture the quaint streets and the quiet lives of the people who were able to exist without steam, without tramcars, without telephones, and all the complexities of modern life? I'm not at all sure that in spite of these deficiencies, the people of that day were not happier than we are now. The 1908 Old Leeds Exhibition Committee largely comprised men like Harding, the city's elite, but not everyone in Leeds saw themselves reflected in that rather complacent and privileged vision of the city and the broader visions of nation and empire it was contained within, however. In fact, that same year of 1908, just a few months later, Leeds witnessed an event capturing that urgent sense of exclusion and alienation from such narratives of progress. Two large groups, one of suffragettes and one of unemployed men, converged on the Coliseum in Leeds during a speech by the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, and attempted to forcibly enter the venue, only to be pushed back by mounted police. Stones were thrown, a window was broken, and various people were arrested, including Bertha Quinn, who was to become a councillor for Leeds during the interwar period. Quinn was not the first woman elected as a local councillor in Leeds, however. That honour went in 1921 to two other women, Gertrude Denison for the Conservatives and Maud Dighton for Labour. Maud Dighton was probably present at the 1908 Coliseum protest. She was certainly active in local socialist and suffragette movements during the same period. Indeed, Maud and Bertha Quinn were co-signatories to a letter published in the Yorkshire Post in 1916, calling for the Council Committee administrating the Naval and Military Services Pension Act to substitute the 5 women of the leisured classes on the committee for working women. At the Central Library, we were very fortunate a few years ago to make contact with Maud's grandson, Peter, who very generously donated us originals and copies of family documents, telling us more about not just Maud, but also her descendants down to Peter himself. Collectively, the documents are a fascinating record of one Leeds family's journey through the tumultuous 20th century, but specifically for our purposes, they capture traces of very localised activism in the first 2 decades of the 1900s. A particular interest is a small notebook belonging to Mary Dighton, Maud's daughter. Mary used this book to collect the signatures of visitors to the Dighton's home during the 1910s, capturing a visit to Leeds by Sylvia Pankhurst in 1916. Peter believes this was during Sylvia's overnight stay at the Dighton's home, while in Leeds for the 1916 Labour Party demonstration on Woodhouse Moor. In a similar way to the book Hans Sloane gifted to Ralph Thoresby, this signature places Leeds in a broader national and international context of activism and intellectual debate. Also included in our Dighton collection is Peter's childhood autograph book, which features the signatures of the Leeds United team from the 1948-49 season, which you can see on the left of this slide. It's far from the only autograph record we have of the city's only professional football club, whose success in the 1960s and 70s was arguably the defining symbol of the name of Leeds in the latter half of the 20th century. Our collections at the Central Library include other autographs of legendary players, such as Billy Bremner and Alan Clark. Most impressive of all, I think, however, is the Lord Mayor's reception book for 1966-67. This book captures a civic ceremony for those Leeds United players and coaching staff who would form part of England's victorious 1966 World Cup winning team, including Les Cocker, Eddie Gray, Norman Hunter and Jack Charlton. The Lord Mayor at the time of the Leeds United contingent's visit in August of 1966 was the man we see holding Jack Charlton's hand in the photo to the right, Alderman Joshua Walsh, the second Jewish Lord Mayor of Leeds, a symbolic mark of the Leeds Jewish community's journey from poverty and discrimination in the late 19th century to the city's middle-class elite. Just 1 year after Joshua Walsh welcomed the Leeds United squad to Civic Hall, another migrant community made a defining contribution to the city's cultural sphere. I said that Leeds United's name probably defined the city during the second half of the 20th century. Roughly contemporary with the first trophies won by that team, however, was another event that is just as essential a building block for any history of Leeds in the last 50 years, the first Leeds West Indian Carnival in 1967. The context for the emergence of the carnival was the post-war migration of Commonwealth citizens from Caribbean islands to British cities, including Leeds. The African Caribbean population of Leeds grew from around 1,000 in 1951 to around 4,000 in 1961 and around 11,000 in 1971. The Leeds encountered by these settlers was not always welcome. The weather was cold and damp and grey. Housing was cramped and inadequate, with most arrivals forced to live in hugely unsatisfactory, old and worn Victorian housing in Chapeltown. And jobs were hard to come by, even for those many individuals with the necessary qualifications. But that very clustering of the African Caribbean population into a specific area had its positive consequences too. The fostering of a spirit of unity among people hailing from different Caribbean backgrounds, leading directly to the creation of clubs and organisations, playing a central role in giving a strong voice to that community, including the United Caribbean Association, the Caribbean Cricket Club, and the West Indian Carnival itself. Local newspapers and magazines also sprang up, providing a platform to explore the issues and tell the stories of individuals and communities, more usually portrayed through local and national media in negative ways. Several of those publications are now in the collections at the Central Library, including Chapeltown News from the 1970s and The Voice from the 1980s. Together, their news reporting, their creativity, and their authenticity as subjective expressions of essential personhood provide a vital insight into the lived experience of people and communities whose voices are more normally erased, obscured, or underrepresented in the stories the city tells about itself, as well as the collections that we hold at Leeds Central Library. The copy of the Voice newspaper seen on the previous slide, which is this one, included an account of a racist attack on 2 young women in Chapeltown in 1982. Sadly, such assaults and abuse was far from unknown in the volatile Leeds of the 1970s and 80s. We saw a rising problem with far-right groups. The independent newspaper, the Leeds Other Paper, which launched in 1974, and which we hold bound copies of at the Central Library, provides an essential index to far-right activity in this period, as well as resistance from left-wing activists, particularly those working through student organisations such as the Rock Against Racism movement. The Leeds of the paper is also an essential source for activism in feminist and LGBT communities at this time, including a report of the first Reclaim the Night March in 1977 and the Leeds Women Against Clause 28 March in 1988. Many of the themes identified at the start of this history, innovation, Leeds' place in national and international networks of trade and ideas, the city's powers of dynamism and self-renewal, often driven by new arrivals into the region, come together in our final section, which brings the story right up to date. With an item so contemporary, it isn't even officially part of the Central Library collections yet, though it will be once we get back to normal. And that's the can of craft beer on the left, which I think represents something of the city over the last 10 to 20 years, the focus on hospitality in the city's creative sector, often driven by non-native graduates, allied to a strong DIY ethos and a sense of community that connects people in the city to local, national and international networks of like-minded people. Beginning in 1997 with the opening of North Bar on New Briggate, often called Britain's first craft beer bar, and in the same year the opening of the legendary Beer Ritz bottle shop in Headingley, Leeds is now recognised as a major player in modern beer culture. As one person I spoke to a few years ago suggested, part of the reason for this is that Leeds has everything in one place. That is production, breweries, distribution, bottle shops, and consumption, pubs and bars, all within a few miles of one another, all feeding off one another and sparking new creativity. And it's not just those directly connected to the beer itself either. The sector draws in and collaborates with graphic designers, artists, other food and drink producers, writers, bloggers, musicians, photographers, a whole community of largely independent creatives. That description is broadly reminiscent of the environments that helped Leeds to flourish during the 17th century, the Industrial Revolution, and during the peak years of the tailoring sector. Indeed, the beers you can see here were brewed by Northern Monk, who perhaps more than any other brewery in Leeds play with their place in Leeds and West Yorkshire's heritage in a creative way, framing themselves quite self-consciously as the heirs to industrial innovators such as John Marshall, in the flax store of whose former mill they are currently based in Holborn. For instance, their 2017 beer, City of Industry, which you can see on the image to the right, pays tribute to both John Marshall and the men and women who worked in his mill. That lineage is woven with a very modern, very cutting-edge commitment to the latest styles and ingredients, an international network of New World hops, and a growing community of local, national, and worldwide customers. Another successful craft brewer in the Leeds area is Kirkstall Brewery, whose company name harks back to a 19th century brewer of the same name, and whose flagship beer, Dissolution, pays tribute to the brewery installed at Kirkstall Abbey's foundation in 1152. In this sense, Leeds craft brewers are merely the latest in a long line of local innovators with a central place in similar networks of commerce, community, and creation, bringing us full circle and to our conclusion. I thank you for listening, and now time for any questions.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that excellent panorama of Leeds history. If you would like to ask a question at this stage, please just unmute yourself and ask the question in the traditional way. Any questions? Charles. got his hand up. Do you want to ask a question? Well, while other people are thinking of questions, let me ask one. When Leeds expanded its population in the 17th and 18th century, do we know where the expansion came from? Was it Yorkshire folk coming into Leeds or from further afield?
I'm sure other people present today can give a more authoritative answer than I can, but my sense is it's a mixture of both. I think I've certainly read that there is in-region migration from other parts of West Yorkshire or Yorkshire, but also a lot of the particularly the big names, the kind of innovators, came from a lot further afield. I mean, some of the names we particularly associate with Leeds today, people like Edward Baines, Matthew Murray, some of the people I highlighted certainly came from outside West Riding, I suppose, as it was then. So, but as I say, I'm sure others can give a more authoritative answer.
Are there any? Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, please, Kevin Grady.
Hello, Kevin.
How you? What, you've obviously got a cold from this.
I always have a cold. I just permanently have a cold. So I'm sorry if I was a bit dry of mouth.
Oh, very, very good. What I'm wondering about is, I mean, one of the big issues for the Thoresby Society and other sort of collectors of items these days is, are you worried that key items will not be collected by, archives, libraries, the Thoresby Society, because they fall between two stools? I mean, is there a policy at the Central Library for what the library will take in?
No, there really isn't. We're a bit slack. I don't know if that's the right word. I don't think we've ever really had a proper sort of collections policy ever drawn up. We're certainly not as good at this as, say, the archives are. So it's a bit haphazard. It's a bit random. It's based on whichever librarians happen to be employed at the time. We do try to collect, as individuals, we do try to collect some of the more interesting kind of ephemera, just the kind of little bits and pieces that you might find, leaflets, flyers, things like that. I've got, my house is full of stuff from the last year that I've desperately want to take into the library to have added to stock, but it is very random. I've collected a lot of stuff other people may not do. So yeah, I do kind of worry about that. And I do worry that our collections for that reason aren't kind of comprehensive and do give a kind of limited and partial view of what Leeds was like at any given time. Certainly.
I mean, do you have many people who just roll up at the counter and sort of hand over things, or do you ask people to sort of ask in advance and then decide what you're going to do? And presumably you've got quite a lot of materials at the library which perhaps haven't yet been catalogued.
Yeah, we do. We've got a huge. We've got a huge trolley or more full of things that remain to be catalogued, and it's always being added to. We do accept donations when people bring them in. I mean, we do. When I say that we don't have any kind of collections policy, that's not quite right, because we do assess the things that we get given and decide whether they are worth keeping or whether they might be better situated with the archives or even with the Thoresby Society sometimes. But for the most part, we do just take everything because we work on the grounds that it's better that it's something is in our collections or in a collection than potentially lost. We get a lot of people emailing us at the moment asking if we can take various things. We do need to draw up a proper set of guidelines really as to what we're actively looking for. And that's the other part of it is us working to identify groups, particularly more marginalised groups and communities whose histories and identities are not particularly well represented in our collections, and to kind of actively work with them rather than waiting for people to hopefully donate materials with us in the future, to try to actively get materials given to us now. That's the other side of it.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Well, can we all thank?
Sorry to interrupt. Just on that, Anthony, nice to see you, by the way. Really missing the library quite a lot. What do you have? You said about collecting ephemera. Does that include do you have a connection with the Discovery Centre, which is also council, but it's part of museums and galleries rather than yours? Because obviously they're for collecting objects rather than documents.
Not a formal connection. I mean, we know we have colleagues who we know who we sometimes work with, who obviously work in the museum sector in Leeds. So we have a kind of general idea of the sorts of materials they collect, and we do try to avoid collecting too many objects. I mean, my can of craft beer that's going to find its way into our collections is kind of an exception in that sense. But I think it was justifiable on the grounds that, I mean, we primarily collect printed material, as you may well be aware. I think the beer cans, to me, were justifiable in the sense that a lot of it is to do with the printed material that's on the can, as much of it being being an object. No, I mean, it's something we've been talking about for a while over the last sort of 18 months, but the pandemic kind of put a pause on it, is setting up some kind of network between all collectors of heritage organisations in the Leeds area that would allow us to have these kinds of discussions about who's collecting what, and to make sure that there aren't overlaps and there aren't gaps, or those gaps are filled. And no doubt the Thoresby Society would be part of those discussions, as would the museum service, as you say. But it's something that's been, I think there's, at one point the Civic Trust was supposed to be leading on it, but it's kind of obviously not top of anyone's priorities at the moment.
Yeah. Can I just ask as well about the, you mentioned a few things there. Is there a downloadable PDF or other way of accessing what you actually have in terms of the collection? Is it on your website? I don't remember seeing a list of objects, or I can imagine you can't get the whole catalogue on there, but how's it recorded?
No, we've got, I don't know what percentage it is, but there is a percentage of our local history collections in the Central Library are on our public online catalogue, but a large percentage of it, particularly the most interesting stuff, the older stuff, is only accessible through our card catalogue, which obviously at the moment nobody can access. That stuff is being very, very, very slowly catalogued by our remaining cataloguers at the Central Library, but it's taking a long time. And again, the events of the last 12 months have kind of put a pause on that. The only other way of kind of finding out what we have, other than just asking us directly, is the Secret Library blog that I highlighted at the beginning. That's one of the reasons why we use that, is to highlight particular items or collections, groups of stock and items. There's a lot of what we call research guides hosted on there, which do provide kind of thematic lists of some of the most interesting stock we have in particular areas.
Yes.
At the moment, those are the best places to look, to be honest.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, no problem.
I've got a question as well, just an explanation. 5 Hannahs of Leeds. What are the 5 Hannahs? I mean, what did that mean?
Yeah, I'm aware that was kind of totally out of context, that little line. It's basically just, I didn't have time to explain what it was, but it's just a collection that we've got. It's just a box that's full of material, kind of ephemera, family history material relating to this particular family who lived in Leeds from some point in the 19th century up into the 20th century. And they had 5 generations of women called Hannah. That's why the box is called that. And this truncheon was in that box. If I'd have had a bit more time, I suppose I would have gone into a bit more detail about what exactly that was. Because I'm aware it was a bit random, just saying at the bottom of the slide.
Thank you. I think we must have a break now, but can we thank Tony for that really excellent conspectus of the history of Leeds? I can hardly imagine how anyone could have summarised the history of Leeds over 500 years so clearly and so interestingly. So can we thank Tony for that talk?
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to propose that we have a 5-minute break now for comfort break, and I hope everyone will return with a glass and we can then drink a toast to the Thoresby Society before the second part of the meeting. Thank you. So can I welcome everyone back to the second part of our meeting this evening and invite you all to drink a toast to the health of the Thoresby Society and our members in 2021. To the Thoresby Society.
Cheers. Yes.
Thoresby Society.
Thank you for that.
Yes. Gorgeous.
More meagre than our usual refreshments, but the best we can do as things are. We now come to our second speaker, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Michael Meadowcroft. He hardly needs any introduction as he is well known for so many different things. I'm only going to mention a couple. His talk, which many people will remember, that he used to give about Leeds politicians, a number of series of talks over many years, which I still hope will one day appear as a book. And more relevantly tonight, he contributed an article on the influence of personalities to the book about the Leeds and its Jewish community history, edited by Derek Fraser and published a couple of years ago in 2019. This evening, Michael's going to talk to us about Gabriel Davis and the establishment of the Jewish community in Leeds. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Alan. And thanks for the opportunity to speak to the Society and its members. We got that on? There we are. Yes, we're there. I looked into the background of Gabriel Davis when, as Alan says, I was preparing the chapter in the book on the history of the Jewish community in Leeds, on influential Jews of Leeds. And I was fascinated with the material that I found, which hadn't ever found its way into the ordinary histories. And indeed, my initial thanks need to go, not just to my resident techie here, who deals with all the pictures, but also to the late Murray Friedman, who everybody who does anything about Leeds Jewish history is always indebted to for his work. Also, for this lecture, to the Rabbi Douglas Charing, who provided good material on Gabriel Davis and the Masonic Lodge. Gabriel Davis is a fascinating character. He's rightly called the father of Leeds Jewry, and there are many facets to his personality, as we shall see. Before him, there were a number of Jewish names in Leeds records, but it was not until Gabriel Davis began to organize it that there was an established community. Given that we are starting in the 18th century, we are fortunate in having a great deal of material available. Certainly there are tantalizing gaps, but there is more than I imagined when I began this trail. There's pretty well everything except a photograph. Of course, we're too early for that. Davis was clearly a very confident person. He was comfortable both as a Jewish leader and by his mid-30s as a businessman in the wider Leeds community. He was certainly persuasive and ideal for such an early Jewish leader. He was born in the small Bavarian town of Mühlhausen in Franconia. There we are. At last we're there. And German speakers will correct me if it's wrong, but I think that the town of Mühlhausen, I think it means mill house. The inhabitants of Franconia tended to think themselves somewhat superior to those of South Bavaria. We know very little of his background, but there is some evidence that his grandfather was a rabbi. Certainly Gabriel was not in the wool trade, as were most of the immigrants from what later became Germany and the first wave of Jewish immigrants into Leeds. Incidentally, there is more work to be done on that initial immigration. A great deal of work is done on the later immigration after the pogroms of the 1880s, but not so much on the earlier people. The name Davis was relatively common in Franconia, and it's not a transliteration into English, although the name may have been changed as a consequence of a law of 1813 requiring the adoption of names from an official list of names. The synagogue in Mühlhausen was first established in the 1840s, following the emancipation of Jews that was promulgated by King Ludwig I. It was damaged in the anti-Jewish riots of Kristallnacht in 1938, but actually was one of only a few synagogues that survived the Nazi regime and the war. It was reconsecrated in 1998. The rising anti-Semitism in the region, particularly in the predominantly Catholic areas of Bavaria, may well have been the spur to the Davis family's emigration to London in 1805, when Gabriel was 16 years old. He must have learnt English pretty quickly, as he studied to become an optician at the time. Given that one's mother tongue is usually well fixed by the age of 16, there is a comment later that he did not have a German accent. He stayed in London for 5 or 6 years, he said. He lived then in Clare Courts in Holborn, near to the Drury Lane Theatre and not far from the present site of the LSE. It was quite a poor area. And Gabriel then moved to Birmingham, he says, for a few months. Whilst he was there in Birmingham, he met Anne Aaron, who was to become his wife. Anne was from an established Birmingham family, and her father and grandfather were both born in the city. Gabriel came to Leeds in 1815. Why the move to Leeds? It's possibly because there was already a Jewish wholesale optician business in Birmingham, but not in Leeds. In fact, no optician is listed in Leeds in the 1817 directory, and only one other than Gabriel Davis in the 1822 directory. He set himself up, he says, in apartments in Mr. Lives's at 6 Commercial Street, where 2 years on he published his first advertisement in the Leeds Intelligencer. Number 6 Commercial Street was towards Brigate, not far from the Leeds Library at number 18, the library being the very first building in Commercial Street in 1808. John Livesey, his landlord, was a barber and a perfumer. By 1822, Gabriel had moved down to Boar Lane into his own premises at number 24. For many years, he described himself as an optician, but he evolved into being a mathematical instrument maker. Gabriel was clearly a very expert and careful instrument maker. His instruments occasionally come up for sale today, and 2 examples are shown that I discovered on a list of items that were for sale, a microscope and a barometer. Gabriel did not spring into action as a fully fledged pioneer immediately on his arrival in Leeds. In fact, he spent at least 15 years building up his business and his contacts. But by 1823, he felt confident enough to join the local Freemasons, and he was proposed as a member of the Lodge of Fidelity in Leeds by Gilbert McIntyre and seconded by one John Barnaby. There were other Jewish members of this lodge, but it certainly wasn't common. McIntyre was an auctioneer and estate agent in a business which later became Hepper's. Barnaby was a brewer. Interestingly, although he was a, quote, adjoining member at Leeds, he may well somehow have become a Mason of the United Grand Lodge of Leeds, of England rather, at Hull in 1815. He didn't attend many Leeds meetings, and he appears to have ended his Masonic membership in December 1824. My view is that he tended to apply for established Leeds bodies just so that he could, but then wasn't really bothered to be active. The next example of this comes with the parliamentary elections in Leeds, following the Reform Act of 1832. Gabriel got himself registered for the first democratic election in December 1832, and he voted Liberal, like all good people do. But as far as I can tell, he never voted again. And of course, it's worth remembering that until the Ballot Act of 1872, how an elector voted was recorded and is a public record. There are 12 contested Leeds elections from the Reform Act up to the final one of 1868, where it was published. The image on the screen is of the 4 involving Gabriel before his death. Now comes the fascinating bit. In the early days following the Reform Act, great battles were fought between the Conservative and Liberal agents, with the aim of getting one's own voters on the register and getting one's opponents off. These cases were heard before a senior barrister. In 1835, no doubt having noted Gabriel's Liberal vote in 1832, the Conservative agent objected to Gabriel's registration, in fact for a second time, on the grounds that he was an alien. Gabriel endeavored to baffle the court. Now you need to bear with me while I quote from the virtually verbatim record of what went on. He was examined, it says, because he was objected to by Mr. Sangster, acting for the Tories. The voter was inserted in the list for shop and workshop in Boar Lane. The only objection taken that was Mr. Davis was an alien. And to elicit the information necessary to prove this, the voter was subjected to a lengthy and cross-examination by Mr. Sangster. The following is the examination. Are you an Englishman? Why you come thick upon me? What do you mean? Why are you born in this country? I cannot say whether I was born in this country or not. Where did your father live? Oh, in England, in Germany, and in France. Were you ever in Germany? Yes, sir. What was your age when you first found yourself in Germany? Oh, I should consider from about 3 years of age. Was your father a German? I cannot tell. I believe he was a Welshman and born at Swansea. I cannot say distinctly, for my father died when I was 4 years old. And then he says to the court, these gentlemen call me an alien. And when I was in Germany, I was called an English boy. The examination continued. What age were you when you left Germany? It was my intention to have left when I was 8 years of age. Then when you first came to England, were you 8 years of age? That was before I came to the court. When were you first in England? I arrived in England on the first day that the Allied armies entered Paris. Mr. Sangster, according to your belief, how old were you when you first came to England? Oh, I should think about 18 or 20 years to the best of my knowledge. That was the first time? I can't tell where I was when I was a baby. Re-examined by Mr. Edison this time. Did you ever swear allegiance to any other continental sovereigns? I've done more, gentlemen. I have fought your battles, and that is more than many of you can say. Mr. Sangster, I don't doubt, sir, that you are anything but a good subject. He does not seem to speak in foreign accents, and the name is not a foreign one. This is not the case as I heard it before, anything like it. The next question. The last time I was here, he says, some of these gentlemen are some of the Tory party and said I was an alien, and I said I was not an alien. Mr. Clarkson, I decided that on the grounds that Mr. Wales, the solicitor, said you had told him you were a foreigner. Mr. Davis, Mr. Wales came to my shop and said, where is Gabriel Davis? I said, I am Gabriel Davis. And he then said, pray, are you a German Jew? And I said, yes. He did not ask me whether I was born in Germany or not. Mr. Clarkson, there is a difference between a German Jew and a Portuguese Jew, I believe. Mr. Davis explained that the difference is related simply to religious opinions and amongst the Jews and not to the question of alienation. It was in reference to religious matters solely that he had answered Mr. Wales's question, and under these circumstances, he considered that he had been very ill-used in being deprived of his parliamentary franchise in the way he had been. Mr. Sangster then asked, did you not tell Mr. Wales that you were a German? Mr. Davis, I said I was a German Jew. What do you mean by that? I mean in reference to my religion. We have differing forms and prayers, and I've argued matters on religious grounds with Mr. Wales. I thought he was a friend. I did not expect him that he wanted to trick and rob me of my franchise. He then, Mr. Edison said, before he is sworn, I beg to submit that Mr. Davis comes here to claim he's an Englishman, and therefore that the onus is upon the other side to prove he's an alien. Well, if they, the Tories, think me an alien, why should they send to my house to press me to vote for them? Let them act like gentlemen. The witness then came in, and we'll leave that out. But then finally, Mr. Davis denied that he'd had a letter from the alien office and said he wished to convince the court that his vote had been struck off before under a wrong impression. He said Mr. Wales, who was opposing him, came to his place and we had various conversations on different scriptures. Mr. Clarkson, was that so? Mr. Wales, yes, sir, it was. Mr. Davis, Mr. Wales called one morning and said, are you not a German Jew? I said, yes. I did not expect you as coming to me like the Inquisition of Spain or like a spy. Is it right for a person to come into my private house to deceive me? I care nothing about my franchise except on principle, and I would sooner lose my life than to be robbed of it by a false impression. Mr. Edison, the voter is given a name which is an English name. He claims to be an Englishman, and I submit that sufficient evidence has not been given to prove he's a foreigner. Mr. Davis, in answer to a question put by Mr. Edison, said, I don't acknowledge allegiance to any other state. Mr. Sangster contended that he had thrown the onus on the other side to prove that his voting was not an alien. Now, unfortunately, good friends, he didn't convince the barrister who, in fact, turfed him out and said on reluctantly come to the conclusion that he was an alien and took him off the register. Now, that was not the end of the matter by any means. It gives a real picture, I think, of what Gabriel Davis was like as an individual. And it gives him a real indication of his personality and his quick mind. But he was struck off. But lo and behold, he still appears on the register. He clearly just carried on as if nothing had happened in the court. And in a further twist to the case, in 1837, he again came before the registration barrier, quote, to prove his qualification. But as he declined to be sworn in, his vote was disallowed. One can only speculate why he wouldn't be sworn. Perhaps he had an eye to being naturalized in the future, but typically his name still appears on the 1841 and 1847 electoral registers. But he didn't vote. It's another example of him sort of collecting status and wanting to show that he's accepted in Leeds society, but thereafter not being interested. By 1840, Gabriel Davis was sufficiently established in Leeds and in the Jewish community to be able to take the lead in gathering a minyan, that is to say 10 men, the minimum required, and establishing a small synagogue in a loft in a house that he bought off Bridge Street on the edge of the Leylands, which later became the Jewish ghetto in Leeds. Appropriately, Gabriel, having become the synagogue's first marriage secretary under the 1836 Registration Act, conducted the first official Jewish wedding, actually at the couple's home in 21 Commercial Court. That is of his own daughter Abigail and one Joseph Parani. And incidentally, that daughter was one of only 3 of 7 children who reached adulthood. She and her husband emigrated to Australia in 1857, and they had 8 children there, but they lost contact with the Jewish life and the Jewish faith. Now, the need clearly was for a proper synagogue, and Gabriel again took the lead by buying and converting a house in back Rockingham Street at the back of what is now the Merrion Centre. But there's another indication of Gabriel's involvement in Leeds society. His name appears on 2 public lists of donations to local charities. His donation there would be around £120 today, so it wasn't insubstantial. But it was his next initiative that would prove to be his lasting, visible contribution to the community. In 1837, he managed to persuade the Earl of Cardigan to give a parcel of land off Gelderd Road in Gilderston for a Jewish cemetery. Some accounts say that it was a gift from the Earl, others it was for a nominal sum, but either way it was a remarkable piece of persuasion. He also persuaded another big landowner, Benjamin Gaskell, to donate, quote, as much stone from Gilderston Quarry as needed to build a cottage and a wall at the cemetery. Here he persuades 2 great Leeds personages with land to actually donate it for the Jewish cemetery. However, there was still a shortfall of funds to complete the cemetery, and in 1839, Gabriel therefore launched a public appeal, which the editor of the Leeds Mercury gave his public support. And the original cemetery is now full, but an extension to it is still in use. The 1841 census shows Gabriel, 4 sons, and a servant living at 1 Mount Preston, now enclosed in the university campus. His wife Anne was presumably absent on the census day, possibly with her parents in Birmingham. By the 1840s, his newspaper and directory adverts had developed with a panoply of scientific instruments for sale. It really is a wonderful set of things if you look at this. G. Davis, optician, mathematical and philosophical instrument maker, and inventor of the new locomotive engine. By galvanic power, has the honor to announce to the gentry and public that in his establishment he has constantly been on hand to have a comprehensive and valuable stock of scientific instruments, spectacles, etc. available. The engineer, surveyor, architect, and experimental philosopher will find in his collection every instrument appertaining to their pursuits. A self-acting galvanic machine for medical purposes. Heaven knows what that was, but a whole list of things that he was working on and had available there. One of the things that he did was to apply for a patent, and this was for a folding level staff. Was that possibly for surveying? Is it one of those things that you see in the street with surveyors doing? And he also applied for a patent for this galvanic machine. Well, I have no idea what that was. Fortunately for us, his naturalization application papers from April 1845 are available online. Such papers are always the best definitive guide to an individual's biographical details. Gabriel's are no exception, though they're hemmed about by approximation as to early dates. But he does state that he was born in Franconia, Bavaria. So much for his evidence for his electoral registration. He describes himself as a mathematical instrument maker, and he states that at that date, he and Anne have 7 children, of whom 3 are living. He assembled a prestigious list of supporters, including James Fallowfield Massa of the Liberal politician and Leeds Printing Company, and Robert Barr of the well-known Leeds Conservative family. By the time of the 1851 census, the family had moved to St. Mark's Buildings Woodhouse, and Gabriel and Anne are shown, together with an apprentice and an assistant and a general servant. Only 8 months later, Gabriel died at the age of 62. Appropriately, he was buried at the Gilderson Cemetery that he had been instrumental in securing. His gravestone is very worn, but his name is just visible. It is, I suggest, an important monument to the Jewish community and to the city, and it really should be restored. One problem is that it is in that part of the cemetery that has become unstable. Efforts should, I believe, be made. My final image is the formal legal notice in the Leeds Intelligencer from his executors. The 2 of them are his nephew and his wife Anne's uncle. Now, my one loose end in this story is that his will is actually in the Borthwick Institute's archive in York, but alas, because of the COVID restrictions, there are no staff there to copy it. Obviously, it's important to obtain it as soon as possible, not least to say what nuggets it may divulge. So it's a fascinating character to whom the Leeds Jewish community owes a great deal. He appeared to have no sense of insecurity as an immigrant. And his personality was such that he overcame whatever prejudice there would undoubtedly have been at the time. And he charmed enough movers and shakers in the city to enable the community to establish a solid foundation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this interesting talk. It certainly told me a lot that I didn't know. Do we have any questions?
No.
Do we know what happened to his children?
Well, let's say 4 of the 7 died in childhood. We only know of what happened to the daughter who emigrated to Australia, and there is not much reference at all. Again, although they lived to adulthood, my recollection from the research is that they still died quite young, actually. It's a pretty miserable existence at that time.
Do we have any questions? I have to say, when he was being examined about his nationality, his suggestion that because his name was Davis, he came from Wales, struck me as being ingenious, but not entirely.
Yes. But I mean, he just lied through his teeth about it all. He had no entitlement at all to be a voter. I mean, but if I think he was the collector of status, you see. And that was another one. He became a Mason, never attended really. And then he thought, well, there's elections on. It's a new register. I'll get registered. He presumably signed that he was, born in Britain, or his father was British or whatever, and carried on from there. And when challenged, he then gave this cock and bull story. But if you note from the verbatim account of it, he shifts around all the time, so he dodges away out of it. When he was asked if he was a German Jew, oh, that was a religious question. That wasn't a geographic question.
Can I ask a question, Alan?
Yes, after you, David, there's one question on the chat line. And
Yeah.
So Sophia asked, do we know which local charities Gabriel Davis donated money to?
Yes, one was for the Leeds distressed poor. I think I seem to recollect that both were the same charity in different years. It was for the relief of the distressed poor of Leeds. I'm not sure if you weren't distressed, what you gained, but they were for that. And it was a public subscription list with some good names on it.
David, over to you.
It wasn't a Jewish charity, that's the point.
David, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, I am unmuted, I think.
Good.
Yes.
Yes, that was a very interesting talk, Michael. Thank you for that. I've been researching an optical instrument manufacturer from South Aram called William Richardson, and I noted in one account that he apprenticed his son Robert to Gabriel Davis. And I wondered if you found anything out about how many apprentices Davis had, or how big his manufacturing operation of philosophical instruments was.
It was quite a big operation. He was in partnership with his with Edward Davis, I think it was his brother early on, and then another brother, John Davis, relative John Davis, also came into the firm. So there were a number of the family, but it seems clear that he had apprentices and assistants thereafter. But I was unaware that you had another connection like that.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think I think it became quite a big firm. When it said he had this place at on Ball Lane, 24 Ball Lane, sometimes 34. I don't know whether that's just a typographical error. The actual place he was in Dickinson's Yard, which I think was quite a big place he had just off Ball Lane.
So on the chat line, Brian has asked, do we know what happened to his business after he died?
It continued, actually, interestingly, it stayed in the family and it didn't disappear until 1962. But it was based in Birmingham after that. That's, I mean, a lot of the family that were part of it were from Birmingham, but amazingly, it stayed in existence right the way through to the 1960s.
Now, Sophia says she's looking at naturalization of members of the Leeds Jewish community, and she'd like to know how you managed to access Gabriel Davis's naturalization papers.
Oh, I just found them online, actually. I mean, did I have to purchase them? I don't remember now, because I got them at the time of doing the chapter for the book. They're in the National Archives, but they did turn up as being available. Liz is telling me that I may have had to pay for them, which I would have done very reluctantly. But I mean, it is good to have them. As I say, it really is the contradiction to what he was saying before the magistrate.
Right. Any further questions or comments?
Yes. Margaret Mosley. I was just going to say that at the moment, you can actually access digitized records from the National Archive for free, and those naturalization records are available, up to 10 documents a day.
Right.
So it's a good time to do it.
It is,
as long
yes.
as we're in lockdown.
Yes, his aren't all that long as it happens, but you know, sometimes, as you said, some of these I did get. I think, yes, I got some of the ones I wrote about as well, which are much longer. Heimer Morris, I think I got, which was quite a long application.
Christina asks, did the Jewish and Catholic communities get on in Leeds?
Well, not particularly, no. There was a great deal of prejudice, and some of it was from the politicians as well, which is better. For instance, James O'Grady was the first Labour MP in Leeds, who was a trade union officer, and he was notably anti-Semitic, was O'Grady, which is a great shame from the Catholic community. Certainly, the record says that in Bavaria, the anti-Semitism was worst in the predominantly Catholic areas. So that would tell you something. But you see, my view of Gabriel Davis is that he had this very proper attachment to the Jewish community and to the religion, so much so that he bought the two houses, the first synagogue and then the proper one, himself. But he also obviously mixed easily with the broader community, and he had no lack of self-confidence. And it seems pretty clear that he was a very personable guy and quite charismatic. I don't think he bothered greatly about what community might have been anti-Jewish.
Do we have any other questions?
Yes, Kevin Grady, I've got two for Michael, actually, and partly to David Sellers as well, really, which is, first of all, obviously, judging from that large page advert in one of the directories, his business was substantial, and no doubt you both got some ideas on how big the community was in terms of shops and selling and making scientific instruments. And the second one is his addresses, because it's interesting to see that he lived in Mount Preston, which is, sort of up by the university, isn't it? So that's a very respectable street to have lived in, and then he moved up to St. Mark's Buildings. I'm not sure about those, but he's not living in a sort of Jewish area as such, or perhaps it's too early for that.
It's too early for that, actually, Kevin. No, he obviously did very well, because he came with nothing and built up from there. So much so that not only could he live in Mount Preston and also have a servant, but also that he was able to have the capital to buy property for synagogues. So he obviously did quite well. But I have no real information as to the possibilities for selling these instruments. But I should think, I had no idea either what the price was. There's no price tag to any of them that I could find, but they're listed in the directories of businesses, not just in the ordinary directories of Leeds.
This is David.
Yeah, yes, I don't have any specific information about how many manufacturers were in the Leeds area, but I noticed in one of the trade directories there were just 2 people, one of whom was Gabriel Davis, entered under the category optician or optical instrument makers.
That's right. That's the 1822 direct, just the 2. Yeah. But you see, he progressed from being an optician to going on to doing the instrument making, and that was quite much wider than just optical instruments as well. He did other things as well. So he did obviously branch. I don't think he was particularly keen on being an optician. Actually, I think he was.
No, he did astronomical telescopes as well.
Yeah. But what was the galvanic machine? That's what I want to know.
Any final question? I think we have time for just one more question. Anybody?
Yeah, Nick Brewster. Just to say, first of all, I was slightly surprised to see that he'd been welcomed into the Freemasons, but which is one thing. But I was just thinking about his business. I'm wondering whether the fire insurance records in some places might have the record for his business. I mean, without knowing what company he insured with, it would be impossible to say. But I know, for example, Guildhall Library in London used to have them, but I think it's Metropolitan Archives in London now.
Yes, I don't know how far such archives go back, because we are talking about a fairly early date. I don't suppose there was the company's house type of thing then. So we might be in some difficulties about that. But there is the famous directory of Jewish businesses in the whole of Britain, which came later, I think about 1880-ish, something like that.
Right.
And there are other directories. But that's another piece of research to go into the actual business. But so there's a question as to where he trained. Well, when he first came at the age of 16, that's when he learned to be an optician from then on. And I assume he must have learned English quickly to be able to study in English in London. But after that, where he learned the trade of being an instrument maker, that presumably is what he picked up from then on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we better bring the meeting to a close now. So can I, on your behalf, thank Michael for a most interesting and informative talk. He's left 1 or 2 open questions, which is always good to leave room for further research. So can we express to Michael in the traditional way?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank everyone for attending at today's meeting. Our next event,
you can see them under the side if you want,
is next Monday at lunchtime, when we have a meeting to launch David Thornton's new exciting book. I think Sue's getting there, we are on the screen. So that's our next meeting next Monday. We're going to have a meeting to launch David Thornton's Leeds, a biographical dictionary at 1 o'clock, and we hope to see you all then. So can I thank everyone for attendance tonight, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the week until we meet again next Monday. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.